It's unusual because a lot of trends don't start in the Midwest, but this one has, and it's kind of going out this way through the country. It's not real big on the East Coast. It's not real big in California yet, but in the Midwest is probably where it's the biggest. It's becoming a lot more popular. Now, you have probably experienced doing something in miniature in your life at some point. If you ever played with a dollhouse, well, you played with something in miniature. Another popular thing that's in miniature that's been around since the 30s is the railroad gardening, where they take the railroads and they build all the things around it. I mean, those guys get into it. Now, 30 years ago when they made railroad gardening, they did everything fake. They used fake moss, fake trees, fake everything. And now you'll see that there's places you can go and tour where they've built these railroad gardens up and they've incorporated live things into it now to make it a living garden. Railroad gardening is probably the one aspect of it that has a consistent scale as far as its pieces go. They use a 22-to-1 scale. And so when you go to buy things for a railroad garden, it's really easy to get your pieces because everything matches to scale on size. When it comes to fairy gardening, though, scale is all over the board. And so you'll see fairies that are this big. You'll see fairies bigger than this. I don't really get any in stock that are bigger than this. You'll get them that'll be little. They'll be little like this. So, when you're looking at your pieces, you want to make sure that you're matching your scale up, because you can buy a bench that's this big, and you can buy a bench that's this big. And so if I were to take this fairy and put it on this bench, it's a little out of proportion. Whereas if I were to use this fairy on that bench, it's a little more in proportion. So you want to try and make sure that when you're putting your pieces together that you get your scale right. The first thing I want to talk about when you're doing the fairy garden is it's really easy to get excited about making one, and it's really addictive. And it's really easy to go and buy a whole bunch of stuff but not really know what you want to do with all of that before you've purchased it. So the number one thing that I recommend before you put a fairy garden together is to come up with a theme of what you want that fairy garden to be. So when I talk about theme, what I mean is in the container that you choose to do it in, we'll talk about some of the different containers. What kind of theme do you want? Do you want to have a beach theme? Do you want to have a woodland theme? Do you want to have a Victorian theme? Do you want to have a fairy tale theme? Do you want to recreate a vacation place that you went and make a little memory of that? Or are you trying to tell a little snapshot of a memory that you have with maybe your grandkids or your kids or your family or someplace you went? And whenever I make a garden, what I'm trying to do is create a little story in my garden, because it's really easy to go, okay, I can buy all this stuff and I can throw it in a box and I got a fairy garden. But it's not as interesting as if you're telling a story in it. So if I look at these four, all four of these tell a little story. So this one is a day at the beach, and we've got the two little girls interacting here. We've got the girl that's surfing on her little boogie board, which is really an orange slice, in the water. This one is a little baby that's hiding in the woods, and the little animals are kind of watching her. This one here is a duck looking into a watering can, and the gnome is peeking around the corner kind of checking out the duck. And this one here is the girls at the lake, and it's a representation of a little tea party at the lake with friends. But each one tells a little story, and they're all different. Some of them have more pieces, some of them have less pieces. Some of them, this one has a house in it. These three have no houses in it. And you can see I still did a house in a very little container. So you don't have to have a huge giant container to be able to use a house. You just got to, how am I going to plan around that? So one of the things that you need to think about is, what's the story that you want to tell in your fairy garden? Okay? Now, is fairy gardening just for girls? No. A lot of men are into miniature gardening and fairy gardening, and I even have little boys that like to do it. And the little boys like to do it with the Matchbox cars, their little transformer pieces, those little action figures they can get. They make great little pieces to put in a fairy garden for a boy. They like to do the dinosaurs. So there's options that boys can do as well that don't have to be the girly thing. Okay, let's talk about scale again. So railroad scale is 22-to-1. Fairy scale is anywhere from a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch to an inch. Well, what does that mean? Well, what it means is if I'm using a 1-inch scale, which is a pretty big scale, it means that if I am 5 feet tall in normal real life, my fairy would be 5 inches tall. So that would be a pretty big fairy, right? So that's a pretty big scale. Now a 1/2 inch scale, take that number and cut it in half. If I'm 5 feet tall, then my fairy would be 2.5 inches tall. Okay, and if I'm using a 1/4 inch scale, that would be like the micro minis, the ones that are real little that would fit like in a terrarium. So my favorite scale to use is between the 1/4 and the 1/2 inch, and that's where you'll find a lot of the fairy things fall into. But for example, houses come in different sizes too. So you can get a big house like this, but for a house like this, you're going to need a bigger fairy and bigger pieces, okay, which is very doable. Just make sure you're matching up your scale to what it is that you're doing. Or you can do a smaller house, you know, along the lines of something like this or something like this, which these are only 4 or 5 inches high, which is around between a 1/4 and a 1/2 inch scale. I'm going to use a smaller fairy with this one, okay? Any questions about scale? Boom, there it goes. All right. The next thing you want to do is you want to pick your container that you're going to put it in. Now, as I stated before, you want to make sure that if you're going to use something that you can't put drainage in, find some way to put drainage in it or use shallow-rooted plants. And by that I mean succulents, and a succulent is a plant that holds its water in its leaves, and it doesn't have to be watered very often, like a cactus or like these plants down here, and I'll give you one and I'll pass it around. You can feel the little leaves on it, and they're real thick and they're real waxy. But what they've done, you can pass it around, they are storing the water in their leaves. So they're always thicker skinned, and they feel like the water, like the leaves are full of water, and that's a succulent. They're also very slow growing. Now, the pros and cons of succulents are pros, if you're a kid or a beginner gardener, great plants to use, because if I forget to water it, I'm not going to kill everything. Cons, though, are there aren't as many outdoor succulents for this region, and we are in a 4B region, that I can leave outside all the time. There's some hens and chicks that you can use, and there's some ground cover sedum that you can use up here that can be inside or outside, and they'll overwinter. But when it gets into like plants like this that have the different shapes, the different colors, the different sizes, you're going to find that those come out of the Southwest, and they are indoor succulents. You can take them outside in the summer, but then you have to bring them inside in the winter. So when it comes to a container that you're going to choose, and the reason I talk about that is because there's a lot of different containers that you can use. You know, I love using the boxes. I like them because, and you don't have to use a box that you buy from a garden center. If you have a box, you can use it. You just have to line it with some plastic and make sure that there's holes in the bottom so that you have drainage. So this one, if you were to purchase this one, what you would do is just stick your finger through there, pull the plastic and cut a hole in that plastic so that the water can drain out. Okay? You need to have the plastic in there though to protect the wood from the elements and the watering and everything else. But if you had your own box, you could do that with plastic. You could do it with a suitcase. That would work, something like that. So think about upcycling things that are at your house. I have seen fairy gardens in kitchen sinks. I've seen them in wagons. I've seen them in bathtubs. I've seen them in bird baths. I've seen them in boxes, suitcases, drawers, bird cages. I mean, you can put them in pretty much anything. Just make sure you have drainage. If you don't, use shallow-rooted plants. Now, I also like to use this kind of bowl as well, and this is a big 16-inch bowl. I like to use this one when I want to use deeper-rooted, bigger plants, something like I'm going to put a little miniature conifer or something in it, because it's going to get a deeper root system than that shallow dish is going to allow for. So these work good, whiskey barrels, things like that. Now, just remember though, if you are going to use a great big container like this, now I have one made up on the front counter in this container, and that sucker is heavy. Yes. So if you're doing it in a wagon, doing it in a bathtub, doing it in a bird bath, you have to be careful of the plants that you use, because if you're using plants that will only survive outside in the summer and then you have to bring it in the winter, are you going to pull a wagon into your house in the winter and put it someplace? You know what I'm saying? Are you going to drag that bathtub into your house? So you're not. That's going to be an outdoor garden that you're going to leave out there. So you're going to have to be conscious of, you're either going to be replacing the plants every year, or you need to use plants that will survive our winter, or use annuals with the little leaves and the little flowers. That way you could actually keep all your pieces and change that garden look out every year by using different plants. And that's an option as well. I also recommend using annuals when you have kids that are doing it, or the succulents, which are not hard, which are hard to kill. But the annuals, if they do kill them, they're inexpensive. You can buy a 6-pack and get a lot of flowers out of a 6-pack for a fairy garden. Just remember, you don't want to use great big petunias though. You want to use little things with little bitty flowers and little bitty leaves. So that's the thing that you want to remember when you're picking your container, okay? But look around your house. You'd be amazed at what you can find to put your fairy garden in. Other things, you know, like I like using these little wheelbarrows. You can make a little vignette in one of these. It's got a drainage hole in it, but I can make a little vignette out of something like this, and it's a nice little interesting container. I've seen it made in a big wheelbarrow too. So other things that you can do the fairy gardens in, and these are more of a terrarium kind of thing, but one of the things that's really interesting to make it in is I've made lots of them in these little bowls right here. These are nice in your office, on a desk, on the kitchen counter, fits in a dorm room real nice as a gift, but these make nice little ones too. And again, I would recommend using succulents in something like this because you don't have any drainage in these, but they're really cool because you can see them all around. And as far as watering goes with these, I don't necessarily pour water in it. I take a mister and just and I water it that way so that it doesn't all pour out the bottom. Another one that you can do, and these come in different sizes, is you've got the terrariums like this that you can do. Now you're looking at this and you're going, but I can't fill that with dirt. How would I do something like that? So on something like this, usually the lid opens up, okay, so that you can get into it. And what you're going to do is you're going to line this with moss, okay? And when I say moss, I mean sheet moss. And so I'm going to pass this around so you can see. This is dried sheet moss, okay? You can pass that around. And they come in sheets. Usually you can buy a pack like this. Now a pack like this, you know, would fill the bottom of this terrarium. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this moss and I'm going to soak it in water. One, it's way easier to work with when it's wet. Two, it goes a lot further when it's wet. And three, it's going to create that water base for you. So what I would do is I would line the bottom of this and the sides with the moss and then put a little dirt in there. And then I'm going to build my garden on there. So the outside edges here will be that moss facing this way. And that's how I'm going to create my basin here in my terrarium. Okay? So when you see something like that, you can do it in there as well. And this is really nice because it's almost like a little hothouse in there. So it's going to create water. And if it gets to where it's too humid, oh, you can just open the lid and you can work in it and everything else. But what I like about these is you can see them from all sides. And I mean, I've seen them as big as this to bigger than this. So these are nice to make gardens in as well.
How do you get the moss to stay up on the side?
It'll stay. It will. What you do is you form an edge and then you put some dirt in there, and it holds it up. I go up about that high. Same thing with one of these baskets. If you have a hanging basket at home, this is another thing that you can make a fairy garden in, or if you're doing it in a bird cage. Again, you could use a cocoa liner in here if you wanted, or you can use the sheet moss. And probably what I would do is put a cocoa liner in here and then moss on the upper edges, fill it with my dirt, and then do my garden with that. But same principle as like doing your hanging baskets with cocoa liner, you could just do a fairy garden in it instead. So same thing here. Well, sheet moss is a living thing that is kind of it's in a dormancy stage when it's dry. When I get it wet, does it grow? No, not really. It just holds moisture really well. I've had the moss in that garden for over a year.
But it's inside.
But I had these all outside, and they have moss on them. Every one of them has moss in them, and brought them back inside. And what I can do is just get the moss wet. And so that works really well when you're watering, or you can use a little mister spray bottle and get it wet that way. The moss isn't going to die. I mean, it's already scraped off and dormant. But when you get it, it comes in these big sheets like this. And you do want to get it wet, though, to work with it. Okay? Okay. I want to make sure. Last time I was all over the board, so I want to stay on track. Okay, so we're going to move a couple of these houses down here. Let's talk about how we build a garden and the proper way to put it together so that you've got the best chance of success. All right, I'm actually going to use one of these little boxes like this. Okay, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put a hole in my plastic, which I'm not going to do because I'll probably take this one apart because I can only have so many of them. All right, so I'm going to put a hole in here so that I have drainage. Then the next thing I want to do is I want to put a layer of rock in here. This can be pea gravel, river rock, whatever you want. You just need to have a layer of rock on here. Now, I recommend a smaller rock than a bigger rock because this isn't a very deep container, so I want to keep it, you know, so that I can still get my other layers on there. Okay, so I've got a layer of rock in there. The next thing I want to do is I want to put a layer of what's called garden charcoal. Okay, I'm going to pass this around. This is garden charcoal. And why do I want to use garden charcoal? Well, one, after time and your pot is sitting, your soil has a tendency to develop odors. And that charcoal will absorb those odors. It'll also absorb any high acid contents that are coming off the plants because it's such a small area, and keep your soil neutralized. So I do recommend that you do this. If you don't do this, it's not the end of the world. I do recommend that you do it though. Now, can you go get a brisket of charcoal off of your charcoal bag and put it in a bag and smush it up and use that? No, it's not the same thing. Okay, this is garden charcoal, not grilling charcoal. Okay, so I'm going to put a layer of that on there, and it is dirty and messy, and it will make your hands black. Okay, so now I've got my layer of rock, I've got a layer of charcoal. Now, the next thing you want to do is have your layer of garden soil. When you put your soil in, you want to use a good potting soil. And what I mean by a good potting soil, it doesn't mean it's expensive. It means it's got peat moss, compost, and sterile dirt. Don't go dig dirt out of your yard. There's probably not a lot of nutrients in it. It's probably got weed seed in it. Go get yourself a bag of potting soil and use that. Don't use moisture control and don't use extra fertilizer in it. You just want peat moss, compost, and dirt, not all that extra stuff. Your goal isn't to force growth. You want this thing to grow slow, so you don't need to be adding, okay? And you don't want it to hold moisture, okay?
If you're doing cactuses, would you use the cactus dirt?
You can use cactus dirt, or you can use this dirt here, a potting soil, and add some sand. Now, I will caution you with sand. When you use sand, do not use playground sand. You want to use a contractor grade sand like that you would buy a bag that you use to level underneath bricks. Don't use playground sand. One, it's really super fine, and two, it's unwashed. So it has a really high content of salt, and therefore it will burn your roots, okay? So if you're using, you can buy bags of, it's called cacti succulent soil, and they sell little bags. You can use that as well. Now you'll notice I haven't filled this all the way to the top because one of the things that I want to do is I want to mix in a little starter fertilizer, and I only do this when I plant my garden at the beginning. This is an 18, 24, 12 fertilizer. Those are the three numbers on the bag. A lot of you might be familiar with what's like a balanced fertilizer, like a 10, 10, 10. But I want the 18, 24, 12 because I want root production. And so I'm just going to sprinkle a little on top, and I'm going to mix that in. Okay, the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to water this before I put another layer of dirt on here because I want the peat moss in here and the dirt to absorb some of this water before I plant. Or what happens is I go to water everything, and what happens? Because it hasn't soaked any water yet, it all goes running off the side. And with it goes all my little fairy garden stuff. So dampen, it's not moist, it's just moist, okay? So I'm getting that bottom soil to take some of that water, okay? Then I'm gonna add some more dirt, and I'll have my drier layer on the top. Okay. So that is how you're gonna layer whatever it is that you're doing, okay? You're gonna layer that in there, and now you've got your base and you're ready to go. I'm about a 1/4 inch down from the top because when I get my plants, they usually have soil with them. I'm not going to take all that off, so I've got to have room for that soil as well, and I can always add soil at the end if I need to, okay? All right. All right, there are tons and tons and tons of accessories available that you can do. So one of the things is, let's say that you decide that, okay, I'm going to do a woodland theme, or I'm going to do whatever theme it is you're going to do. The first thing that you have to decide is, what is your focal point? Is it going to be a plant? Is it going to be a fairy? Is it going to be a house? Usually those are the three things that you're going to go with as far as choosing what that focal point is. Or it could be a big structure. Okay, so like this could be a focal point in my garden. Now, if I buy a piece like this and I go, oh, this thing is just too big, it doesn't go all the way down in my shallow little container, you can just take wire cutters and cut the ends off so that it'll go all the way in. Okay, if I decide that my house is my focal point, you know, then I'm going to use my house as a focal point. If it's a smaller garden like this one, my focal point here was the baby. Okay, my focal point there is the house. My focal point here is actually, believe it or not, it's the umbrella and the chair. Okay, if it's going to be a big tree, you know, is my big tree going to be the focal point? Okay, before I dig anything in the ground, I'm kind of like figuring out what story am I telling, what am I doing. So if I've decided, you know what, I'm going to do this is going to be my big tree next to the house, and this is going to be my house, and I actually kind of want to maybe put this at an angle, and I'm going to do a little path in here, and maybe I'll have a little potted area here and do a little vignette right there with a couple fairies with a bench and what. Maybe I want to make like just a little garden scene. Okay, or maybe I don't even want to use a house. Maybe I want my focal point to be a fairy. Instead, maybe I want my focal point to be a fairy, and the fairy is running towards or is chasing these ducks that are going down a pathway. Maybe I want that, and I just want a little vignette that leads to something else. Okay? So think about how you want to use your accessories and what accessories you need to make your little story. Okay? Now, you don't have to buy everything. The next part that I'm going to show you are different ways and different things that you can do with stuff just from right around your house. And you'll start walking around your house and you'll look at things differently. Okay? So, for example, okay, bark off a tree. It makes great little things to build up. It makes great pathways. It makes great driftwood if you're doing a beach area. You can even make, if it's tall enough, you can make a fence out of it. I mean, lots of different things that you can use bark for that you can find just probably laying around your yard. Okay? All right, other things that you can do laying around your yard or around your house. These are, I did some tile work in my bathroom, and this was a piece of tile that I had left. And you know how they come in those big squares, and so basically I could use this as a patio piece and put it in the center and put my table and stuff on it, and I can use it as a patio piece, or I can break them apart and I could make little stepping stones out of them. And I mean, I'd probably, you know, I'd go through and get those pieces off, but I could make stepping stones out of those as well. Or if I didn't want to have gaps in between, you can go buy one of those bathroom tiles. You can get them for 39, 59, 69 cents. And you can make a patio platform out of that. Okay? So that's something that you can do. Other things that you can do is when we made that wall in the cafe, we had all these extra little pieces of tile left. And see these? I could take them and I could stack them together and I could make like almost a wall out of them. And it would look like natural stone. And I could make like a stacked stone wall with them and put that in my bed. And they're just little scraps that were left over from a project that we did. Other things that you can use, this is a Mexican pebble, but to a fairy, this is a boulder. Okay, look at how big that is. So this could be a big boulder that I put in my scape as well. Other things that you can use are different color decorative stones. You know, there's white stones, there's brown stones, there's pink stones, you know, and you can line a path with them, or you could make the outline of a pond with them. So, and those are just rocks that I picked up out of the yard. If you want to put them in a bleach solution, you can. If you feel like there might be some parasites or anything on them, I never have, and I've never had an issue with it. Other things is if you're looking at this and you're going, well, that's awful big. I'd like to have a smaller little stepping stone. One of the things that you can do to make stepping stones, if you don't want to purchase them, is go and get yourself a cheapy candy dish tray. This is what you would make candy in. You get them at like Michael's or Walmart. And what you do is you just spray it with some pan spray, okay? And I use what's called a vinyl patch concrete. And what it is it's a little bag that comes like this, and it says right on there, vinyl cement patch. And the reason I use the vinyl instead of the Portland is because there's less aggregate in it. So what I mean by aggregate is usually when you buy concrete, it's got sand and stones and everything else in it, whereas this vinyl patch is real smooth. Okay, and what I do is I just mix it up with some water, and then I put it in my little forms, and then I let it dry and pop them out. And you can paint them or do whatever. So these I made a couple days ago, and I let them, and so, I mean, you just turn it over, they pop right out from the pan spray. Just makes them come right out, and they're shaped like little flowers. And then if I wanted to paint those, I could just paint those, and then I'd have my own little stepping stones. And they have all different kinds of candy dishes that you can use. And so for just a couple cents, and I do leaf casting too, and I use the same kind of concrete for leaf casting. But now I've got all these stepping stones that I made for, you know, pennies compared to, right. I'm all about what can I do cheap, because we have concrete color here. Yeah, you could add color to it. I think you'd have to have the concrete color to do that. And I haven't done that because I just haven't done that. I just made them gray. But it's a nice, inexpensive way to make a bunch of stepping stones, especially if you want to make a nice long path. Another thing that you can use to make paths is pea gravel. But I actually I'll spend a little bit more money and get a little nicer gravel because it's prettier. Some of the washed river gravel. And when you make a path, what you're going to do is you're going to dig a little trench out wherever you're going to put that path. And the reason that you want to dig a trench and not just put a thin layer on top of the surface is because if you just put a thin layer on the surface and then you start to water this thing, all of that dirt's going to bleed up through your rocks. So you need to get a good ½ inch of rock in your little path so that when you're watering, it doesn't bleed up through. Okay? So that's another thing that you can use. Other things that you can use, popsicle sticks. Popsicle sticks, if you glue them together, make a nice deck. Okay? So they make a nice little, they can make a patio, they can make a nice little deck. If you glue them all together and get them close together, then now you've got a little platform that's like a deck. That if you're using a bigger one, they sell different size popsicle sticks too. But like it could be a deck off my house, or it could be a deck on the beach, or popsicle sticks are a nice thing to use as well. Other things that you can do are, you can make your own fence. So one of the things you do is you go out and you find yourself a nice dead branch. Okay, you don't want it to be just cut off of a tree or just cut off of a bush, because sometimes when you cut them and you put them in your soil, they'll propagate. And the next thing you know, you've got leaves growing off the top of your fence. So try to find, especially like a red twig dogwood, if you cut the ends off of those and stick them in soil, bring them inside, by spring, they'll have sprouted roots and they'll have flowers and leaves on them. That's how easy they are to propagate. So, but you could do that. You could make a red fence out of a red twig dogwood. Just let it sit for a while so it dies so that you're not propagating. But what you could do here is, find the straightest branches and cut it. So like, for example, I made this little fence yesterday. And so basically all I did was I just cut some thicker ones into ends, and make sure you give yourself something that you can get it in the ground. You got to have some kind of stake on there on the end. I used twine to tie it together, and then I used glue right through here. Now, what kind of glue did I use? Well, I can tell you, I've used a glue gun. This is my very first attempt years ago at making a piece of fairy furniture. I made it with a glue gun. I'll let you pass it around and you can see how ugly it is. It looks like it's coated in frost, because you can see every glob from the glue gun there is. I even tried spray painting it brown and it all faded off. So a glue gun, not only that, it doesn't hold up outside. So when you do this, you want to use super glue. Okay, super glue is your glue of medium, because it'll withhold the elements outside. So, and you can make this smaller, and just know that the smaller you make it, the harder and more patient you have to be putting it together. You could put more fence rungs in here, but you can make a little fence, all on your own. But that was my very first attempt at making an arbor. And I found that actually, as much work as I put into that thing, it was cheaper to buy one. Because I want to say, by the time I cut this, glued this, put it together, got frustrated, threw it across the room. It was a couple days before I got it together, because I had to do it in sections. And so, I mean, if you like fiddling around with that, great. I don't really have the patience for it. But I keep this as a reminder of not a glue gun and how much work it was. And it was my very first attempt. So those are things to think about. Okay, so you can make your own little fence. Other little creative things that you can do is, this is a kite that I made, and I guess I passed it around and they must have lost some of my bread ties. I made this out of dental floss, a bread tie, and a plastic cup. Okay, and basically all I did was I went and got a red plastic cut and I cut the kite shape out of it. And then I took a sewing needle and dental floss and I sewed on the tail. And then I took the bread ties, and I had 3 of them on there. I don't know what happened to the other 2. And I put those on there like the tail. And what I do with something like this is I'll put fishing line here and I'll tie it to a tree, and then I'll run it through a fairy's hands and it'll be suspended in the air like a kite. So lots of things that you can just think about. I mean, think about that. You just think, and you can Google things too. Google fairy ideas. All kinds of things will come up on Pinterest and everything else. Some are more complicated than others. I go for easy. We like easy. But that one was a really easy one to do, and it was really cute. Other things that you can do on your own. Let's see. We've shown you the stepping stones and, well, just, I'm serious. Walk around your house and look for what it is that you can use. Even broken, broken seashells. If you're doing a beach scene, they work really good. Like I said, bark works really good as driftwood and things like that. So look for things around your house that you can use. Okay? So the next thing I'm going to talk about is, let's talk about arbors, gazebos, and the little things that you can grow the vines up and around. Okay? So when you do this, what you want to do is make sure that you have a small leafed plant. Okay, whatever it is. Baby's tears is a really good one. Even these, the little ivies, if they got the real little leaves, work real good. This is a button lemon fern. These actually work pretty good if you have the patience to wind them up through there. Now, you go and you look at this plant here and you go, holy cow, that's a big plant. I'm not putting that whole plant in here. And you wouldn't. And even when you bought a baby's tear, you might buy it in a container that's only this big. Okay? But what you're going to do is you're going to pull this plant off of here and pull a chunk of it off. Make sure you get a good root section. Then what you're going to do is don't try to put it in the ground and then weave it. Okay? Hold it. You might need a helper or set it on the table. Set it down. Weave it through and then put it in the ground after you've anchored it to the arbor, gazebo, or whatever it is, because it's easier. If you plant it in the ground, what happens? You're trying to weave that plant through there and you end up breaking it. You end up snapping this, and then you're like, oh, I need a new section. So it's easier to leave the root ball that you've pulled off of there loose, thread it on there, and then plant the whole thing in the ground. You don't have to cover the whole thing. It will grow. It will grow. It'll keep going. Just train it. Just train it to keep going. Okay? So what you're doing is you're looking for something with really little leaves. And these are great things to be able to weave those up and through on. Another nice thing that you can do is if you have a smaller one of these, or let's say you don't want it on the top, you just want to grow it up each side. One of the ground cover succulents, like the voodoo, the dragon's blood, some of those ones that get those runners on them, they're a ground cover sedum. If you're going to use a sedum, because you don't want to have a leafy plant, plant those on either side, and what will happen is they'll grow their little tendrils, and you can just poke it through the hole, and then they'll grow up the sides of each of these. And what's really cool is a lot of those have really neat colored foliage on them, from green to red, and they'll get bright pink flowers on them, and it's really cool looking. And again, if you're going to do this with leafy plants, use leafy plants. But if you want to put something like this in and you're going to use succulents, that's your option for your succulents to run up your arbors and your gazebos. Okay? Let's talk about making water next. Okay, there's a lot of different ways that you can make water. Now, you can do what I've done in these two here. This is a beach. And what I did was I have the blue rocks here, and I've created the ocean, and then I created some white rocks on the edge to kind of show the foam coming up. This one here I created like a little pond, and again I filled it with the blue rocks. Now they also have pieces that look like this that kind of simulate what water looks like. So you could do something like that in there. But what I found with those is if I don't put some blue rocks underneath it, it kind of gets lost in the dirt. So I always find that if I put some blue rocks underneath it, it kind of peeks through and it looks more blue. If I'm doing something like this, I've had people ask me, well, can't I just put water in it? Well, sure you can. Just remember, though, that outside standing water will become stagnant. Also, it'll evaporate really fast because it's not a very deep container. So if you want to go out there and fill it up every day, go for it. But personally, I don't want to have to do a lot to my fairy garden once I get it done. I have enough to do. I want to enjoy my fairy garden and kind of brag. Look at my fairy garden. You know, it's a conversation piece on your back porch. So you kind of, you know, you don't want to have to maintain it. But you can use something like this as your water piece and then put the blue rocks in here. Or you can use this as your water piece. Or you can just do the blue rocks with none of this. Now, again, when you're doing water, one of the things that you want to remember is if you're going to make an area, and I don't want water in this one. I'm just going to do it right there. If you're going to make an area that you're going to have a simulation of water, again, one of the things that you want to do, just like what you did with the path, is you want to pull some of that dirt away and create like a hollow in there. Now, I highly recommend fish gravel for fish tanks. Great. Perfect size. Totally small. Blue, red, green, multicolor, white. I mean, you can do so much with fish gravel and it's really inexpensive. So what I do whenever I do water is I always make sure that I put a layer of white on the bottom. The reason I put the white on the bottom is because I don't want, again, I don't want that dirt to bleed up through my blue. And so I put the white on the bottom so that if any bleeding does happen, it's white that's bleeding through and not dirt. Okay, and then I'm going to put my blue on top. Okay, and I use fish gravel. That's what I like to use. Okay. Any questions about making water? Same thing if you're making a stream. You do it just like a path. Okay, you're going to do a stream. One of the things that you want to do, though, is you want it to look natural. So it does look more natural if you line it with some little rocks. So let's say I'm going to have, you know, the little lake here and the stream here. Line it with some rocks and kind of try to make it look like it would look, you know, in nature. So it wouldn't just be there. It would be lined with something. Okay, and that'll give you some definition in there as well. All right. Any questions so far? I always look for fairies that are doing things. See how she's got her arms up in the air? I could use her to run towards something like she's excited. I could use her to fly a kite. So lots of different things that I could use her for. This one here, she looks like she's walking. Okay. And so I could also get her on a bike because her legs are, I can make it look like she's riding a bike. Okay. I don't want them all to be sitting. I want them to be doing something. That way I can create action and I can tell my story. So how do I do that? Well, two fairies. Two fairies doing something together is creating action. A fairy involved in something like flying a kite, riding a bike, that's creating action. Now, do they have to be a fairy interacting with a fairy? Heck no, I can have a fairy interacting with an animal. That's going to create action. By introducing just one more element or one more piece of a live thing, now I've created action in my garden. And it's however you want them to interact. Okay? Now, can I create action with just one thing? Yes, it depends on what they're doing. I have one little guy in here, and he's in my cafe garden. And it's a little bunny rowing a leaf boat. And what he is in the garden over in the cafe is he's in a big, vast, like ocean, and he's rowing his boat over to this little island thing that we have set in there, so it creates a scene. So different things that you can do to create that. So even though in here I have a baby kind of hidden in the forest, and I got the little leaf, you know, and I got a little raccoon here kind of watching over her. So all of these tell like a little story, and I've created a little action. Okay? All right. Other things that you can do to create action is, let's say I wanted to make a maypole. I don't have to buy a maypole to do that. I would probably find a thick stick. Because a maypole really is just, it's just a stick. Okay, that's what a maypole is. Okay, and then I would probably go get some of that curling ribbon or some of the ribbon and tie the ribbon around it. And then you could have the fairies holding the ribbon going around in a circle. And you can make a maypole. And all I really did, well, I have ribbon at my house. How many of you have ribbon at your house? Okay, how many of you have a stick at your house? Okay, I could make them and have the ribbons tied and maybe wrap some of them around, and then they're going in a circle. I mean, so there's lots of different ways that you can do it. All right. See, I could have one here. One, I mean, it's just so many things that you can do with it. All right. different plants that you can use in your gardens. Okay, let's talk about the different kinds of plants. So there are miniature conifers. These are designed to grow small, be dwarf, stay small. A lot of these, make sure you're checking your tags for the zone. We are in a 4B. So if it doesn't have at least a zone 4 or higher on it, these are things that you're going to have to plant in your garden and bring in and out. If it is got a zone 4, it's going to be able to survive the winter. Now, because it's so little and it's a baby, I still recommend if you're doing this outside right in the ground, I've seen people make their gardens right in the ground, you're still probably going to want to protect this over the winter. Put some mulch on it, some leaves on it, and then clear those back off in the fall because it still is a little baby, okay, even though it's little. But these make nice little bushes, trees, whatever. There's different sizes, shapes that you can get, but they're a little more expensive. So it's, you know, you're going to have a long-term garden. Sometimes these are worth the investment of one of those to give you that focal point in your garden.
You have to water that often?
Just like your normal garden. And that's the thing, is how do I know when to water my garden now that you've brought that up? Stick your finger in it. Is it wet or is it dry?
Right.
I mean, it's that simple. It really is. Your plants will talk to you. If they're drooping, they need water. If the leaves are falling off, they probably need light. Okay? Or they might need an infusion of fertilizer. Okay? But more times than not, if the leaves are falling off, it's because they're not getting enough light. All right? Or it could be you're overwatering them. Okay. Other things that you can do, this is a little mini Unanimous. It's a dwarf Unanimous. You see these growing as bushes in your yard, okay? But this one has been grown as a standard on a stick. There's other different kinds too. This is an olive tree. So this definitely, you think this is gonna live outside in the winter? No, these are gonna be indoor. And you're gonna find 80% of the plants that you wanna use in your garden are gonna be indoor plants, but they can be outside once the temperature is above 50 degrees, okay? Other little things that I like to use, I love using chicks and hens. If you have a chick, it'll make hens. Okay, so all of these little hens I cut off of a chick. So it's the chick is the big one and the hen is the little one. The little ones are great for planting, and what happens is, see that nice little root on there? They're great for planting in little containers. You'll get the little urns and things that you can buy, and you can put a little sand in there. I'd probably say 50% sand, there it goes, 50% water, and you can, thank you honey, and you can plant that right in there, and the easiest way to water is with a mister, because if you try to water it with a watering can, it's so hard to get the water in there. A mister works the best. Or even the little bucket, you know, I can plant it in the little buckets. Other things that I like to use in the buckets to simulate apples are the little berry sprays from winter, you know, the little berry sprays that you get with the little red berries on them. Just cut the berries off. They make great apples. Okay, fill your bucket. The one thing I do caution though is get the weather resistant ones, or they end up cracking and peeling and everything outside. But those do really well. Bittersweet is another nice one. You can get it in the fall. Looks like little orange berries. Those work good in there too. Or even the little crab apples that come out on your trees. You can use those, but you have to kind of watch them in the buckets, because if you don't change them out, they will rot. That's why I like to use the little red berries, because I don't have to worry about them rotting. The other thing is they're the perfect size if you have a fairy like this. If her hands are kind of like that, you can glue the little berry in her hand, and it looks like she's eating the apple. Okay? Now, I'm going to talk about this real quick before I move on. You will notice that some of the things I showed you have the little spikes on them, and some of them do not. Okay? Now, if you're bringing your garden outside and you have squirrels, the squirrels like to come and steal your little pieces. They do. It sucks. But there's things that you can do to prevent that. One of the things that I like to use is a roofing nail. I like to use the roofing nail because, one, it's metal. A golf tee works too, but I like the roofing nails better, whereas the golf tee over time, it'll rot, whereas this will not. It's got a nice flat tip on it. And what I do is I just take some super glue and I glue it to the bottom of my fairy or my item or whatever it is. And now I've got something to stake into the ground so the squirrels can't come along and take it. Okay? Another thing that you can do, and that one is not, I'm going to grab something from over here. Let's say you want to do a tea party. Here, I'll just grab this one. Okay? So I got these little dishes and everything. So let's say you're going to do a tea party kind of like this. Now I don't have this. I don't have anything in there secured or glued because people pick things out of there and buy them and whatnot. But I don't want the wind to take this or the squirrels to take this, or every 5 minutes I got to walk over there and put everything back on. What works really good is you get those clear pieces of two-sided, not tape, but the mounting tack. Put that on the bottom of this and put that on here. One, it'll peel off, and two, it'll secure this to your table so that they aren't blowing all over the place. You can do the same thing. You know, you can still put a roofing tack on the bottom of these to get it in the ground. So those are things that you can do to secure those on there so they're not blowing off, because the wind can blow it off. Okay? So those are things that I do. I find the points, and you know, I other plants that you can use. Hens and chicks, we've talked about some of the taller ones. Other ones that you can do, they're called steppables. And so, for example, this is what's called this is a thyme. See how little bitty those leaves are? There's also woolly thyme, there's Scotch moss, they're ground covers. And what you do is you buy one of those and you pull it out of the tray and you just kind of break it up a little bit and put it in there, and it'll start to creep and spread. Now this one here, at my first class, I trimmed it, okay? Now on this one here, I'm going to show you this one here. It has the same exact plant in it, and when I first brought it inside, I put it in the wrong spot, and it wasn't getting enough light. So I have some dead. See the dead in here? And you can see the new growth that's coming up. Because basically what I did was, I was like, oh no, it's dying. So I moved it into a place that had more light, and then I took some Miracle-Gro, and I watered it, and now I'm starting to get new growth. And it will recover, but I fertilized it, and I moved it into a place where it was going to get better light. But I almost lost it. And then I would have had to replace it. But I'm like, no, I'm going to make it live. So I fertilized it instead. So one of the things when you bring it into the winter is you might want to give it some fertilization. But the biggest thing that we do is we overwater them in the winter, and we don't put them in a place that has enough light. You don't want to stick them in a window where the sunlight is like pounding on it and it's reflecting, because that'll burn your leaves. But you want to put it in a place that's got enough indirect light that it's bright.
So like what window?
East windows are good in the morning because the sun isn't as intense. And a southern window is good as long as it's not in the window, but maybe far enough away that it's getting that reflected light.
You just said southern exposure on a plant stand right in front of the window.
And it might just be that, and even though the sun is at a lower angle in the winter than it is in the summer, it's still intense enough that when it's hitting that window pane, it's creating a reflection, and that might be what's burning your leaves.
I had it on my deck where it gets full sun in the summer, but I never thought about reflected and burning. I didn't know what happened. They all turned around.
Yep, and they might need fertilization too. Yeah. I don't fertilize, I mean, I might fertilize this thing twice a year. I put some starter fertilizer in it when I started to get it going, and then that was way back, well, even these, that was way back in early spring when I made these. When I brought them inside, I fertilized them, but then I put this one in the wrong spot. So this one actually got a double dose of fertilizer, because this one I'm recovering. So,
You can use Miracle-Gro.
oh yeah.
If
Mhm.
you've already planted.
Just make sure you read the instructions.
Right, use just a
And
little.
just use the proper amount. More is not better.
Right.
Follow the instructions on the label. More is not better. Oh, they get heavy.
Say weight-wise, what do you think that weighs?
15, 20 pounds.
Okay.
And that's a little one. That one up there, I bet you easy it weighs 40 pounds. So,
And you do need that much dirt in it. So you almost.
well, now if I wanted to cheat and use shallow root because I want that big of a container, I could have put popcorn on the bottom of it, the little styrofoam popcorn. And a little trick with the popcorn, put it in a nylon, because then it stays in place. You know when you go to dump out the pot the next year and then the popcorn pieces go all over the place and then you feel like you gotta go get some new ones? Just put it put them in nylons, and then when you dump everything out, you still got your popcorn pieces in the nylons, and then it still takes some of that weight away. That one there, I have some plants in there that needed a deeper root system. That's why it has so much dirt, because I have conifers in it. I needed the deeper root system. So, okay. Other things are little small perennials. Ajuga. They make great looking little bushes. That little bitty plant will look like a bush. Or even some of the itty bitties, like these are some of the itty bitties that I have left over winter, and they're actually getting kind of big. But like this would make a great tree. You know, this would make a great tree. And itty bitties, you can trim them down to make them smaller. Asparagus fern is a favorite that I love to use. You can get them cheap in the spring. And I love to use them because they simulate like a forest. And so I have it in this one here, whereas if you look, it looks like there's kind of a forest back there. And all I have to do, because asparagus ferns are they're pretty hardy, so it's probably the most high maintenance thing that I have in my gardens. But basically what I'm gonna do is, if I start to get runners on it, I just give it a little haircut.
Got some runners right now.
Yep, I just give it a little haircut. And if it starts to get too thick, I just come in and I pull a piece and I just cut it out. Yep, I just go in there and I thin it. I've probably thinned this thing 5 or 6 times because it's probably the most work, but I just love the foliage on it because it creates that forest look for you. So I like to use those, and if you kill it, they're so cheap. So, and what I like about them is they're one of those plants that you grow as an annual outside in a pot, but if you bring it inside, it lives.
Right.
And if you don't let it get crazy big, you know how they shed like crazy, but if you keep it that size and trimmed, they don't shed all over the place. The other thing I do is when I plant those, I have a tendency to always plant those on the back or the sides, the edge of the pot, so that when I go to trim it, I can trim it, it all falls out instead of in. And then I end up with all those little shavings all over. So I like that as well. Other things, ground hugging succulents, those work good as ground cover. Anything with a little bitty leaf on it. Moss works good. You could do grass. You could plant grass seed if you wanted. You're going to have to cut it, but you could do grass. If you don't want to do real grass, you could go buy a piece of artificial turf and use it. I don't know that I would put that in mind, but I haven't tried the grass yet, mostly because I don't want the maintenance of having to give it a haircut. Look for things with little bitty leaves, hens and chicks, any of the itty bitties. These are cuttings that I took off of one of these, so I could make low growing ones. So I just took a couple cuttings and I put some root starter on them, and now so these are going to make a nice little ground cover for me, but I love the variegated foliage on it. And that's the nice thing about when you're using succulents. I'm going to grab this great big one here. Okay, so this one here, look at how big that one's gotten. I really don't want it to be this big, but what's nice is I can take this thing and I can cut it in half, okay? Now, I can take all of these off. Now remember which is the top and which is the bottom, okay? I can take all of those, go get me a little pot like this. And I'm going to add a little bit of sand because they're succulents. And I'm going to mix that up. All right, and I can take these suckers and just stick them right in this dirt. And I'm going to make a whole bunch more because those will propagate. And I can actually take this, I could cut this in half again, and I can stick this in here. That'll propagate.
Could you do that in your box or not really?
Sure you could, but I don't recommend it because that's going to disturb everything you're doing. But if I wanted to, let's say I want to use this instead, yeah, I could take this and put it in there.
Would you have to put sand first though?
If I'm using succulents, I would put sand in this.
I mean, to propagate that though.
Well, I'm only using sand in here because these are succulents. Okay, but see now I've got all these other little, and I could take even these and start all of those because they are so easy to propagate. And how do I know that it's ready to be transplanted? It usually takes about 2-3 months. Okay, if it's just a leaf like this, it's going to take a little bit longer. But when I give it a little tug, can I feel the roots pulling back? If it comes right out, it's not ready. Okay? So I'm going to put this in a nice warm place, and I just made myself a whole bunch of new ones. That's what's nice about succulents too. They're crazy easy to propagate. Okay? But I can use this in my garden. All right. I like using the little, because this one here and the woolly thyme, that's another nice one. They'll get little white flowers. I mean, they are itty bitty bitty, but they'll get full of little white flowers in the spring. All right. All right. So now I've got my garden. I'm sorry, I usually make one, but I've made so many, I can't make another one. So now I've got my garden and I've got something hoo-hoo, look at me, I got a garden. Come over and have lunch with me and check out my beautiful garden. Anyway, so now I've got my great garden, my conversation piece. It tells my story. What do I do with it? Well, I want to make sure that if it's inside, that I provide it with bright indirect light, but avoid direct sunlight, which can burn the leaves. I want to water it. I want to keep the soil moist, but I want to take care not to overwater it. How do I do that? Stick my finger in it, okay? I know, it's so low tech.
Except for a cactus, isn't
You're going to let that, well, you still can stick your finger in there to know how dry it is.
Okay.
You're going to let cactus and succulents, you want them to dry out before you water them again, okay? Overwatering is the most common problem with interior plant care. Try to stick to plants with the same water requirements. So what I highly recommend you not do is put succulents and leafy plants in the same container. And now I have them in there, but they're separated. They're not right next to each other. You'll notice that this garden here is all succulents. It's got the hens and chicks, and it's got my little succulent here. This one is all leafy plants and moss. Okay? Now, the other thing I want to do is temperature. Indoor plants thrive at a temperature between 65 and 75 degrees. So again, even if it's in a window, how cold is your window pane? That's another thing to look at. If it's right up on the window and maybe it's not getting southern exposure where the light is reflecting back and forth, how cold is that window pane? Is that a little micro area at your house where it's cold right there? Because I know at my house, I have some windows that are the new windows that tilt and there is no draft, but then I have a big picture window that's old and I have to do the whole Menards shrinky dink plastic wrap on it thing because it's an old window, but it's drafty right there. So how cold is it? All right, fertilizer. Use a water-soluble fertilizer like a Miracle-Gro I do it twice a year. I do it when I bring it in the winter and I do it again when I bring it out in the spring. If you want to do it more than that, feel free. Just know that your goal is not to make it grow as fast as possible. You want it to grow slow, but you want to keep it healthy. So there's a balance, okay? All right, maintenance. Remember, it's a miniature landscape garden. Trimming the plants regularly is encouraged. Like your landscape at home, you want to keep the plants maintained at a decent height and size. I have trimmed all of my gardens. I trim that one. I trim them. I don't do it all the time, but I pay attention to them. For somebody that's a new gardener, again, I recommend succulents because they're easier to grow. Moss. There are two different kinds of moss. The first one I passed around was that sheet moss that I showed you. This next one that I'm going to pass around, this is called a reindeer moss. Now, reindeer moss is a different kind of moss. It's airier. It doesn't have the root system on it like the sheet moss does. And it comes in different colors. I've seen it in chartreuse, blue, red, pink, green. I mean, it comes in every color under the rainbow. You can use that as well in your fairy garden as you do the regular moss. Now, one of the things that you need to do when you're working with moss is you need to get it wet before you use it. And so what it does is it makes it easier to use. So this is some reindeer moss. I think I'm out of container, so I'll wait till, here, I'll use this one. This is now reindeer moss that I've gotten wet, and it's a lot easier to work with. So once it's in your garden bed and you want to fluff it back up, because reindeer moss has the one that has a tendency to dry out the fastest. If you want to fluff it up, make it vibrant, just get a spray bottle out, spray it, get it wet. It'll soak that water up and puff right back up, okay? But this is what you're going to use in between your areas where you don't have plants or you don't have something. That's where you're going to use your moss. Or if you don't want to use moss, you could use mulch, like small mulch, finely shredded mulch. What you don't want is exposed dirt. Okay, when you're done, it's not that you have to have a plant in every square inch, because that's what the filler moss is for, that's what the mulch is for, or whatever you're going to use as your medium. You want to have this whole thing covered with something. The reason you want to do that is so that you can regulate the temperature of the soil so it's more consistent. If you have bare areas of dirt, especially if it's outside, well, guess what? Weed seed blows in the wind, birds bring it along with them. You're more prone to get some weeds in your bed, and that area will dry out faster because there's nothing covering it to protect it. And by having the moss there or the mulch or something else, you're helping with not letting a weed seed germinate and keeping that soil temperature regulated. Okay?
I use
I would use some kind of rock to create a border between where that mulch is and where that rock is. So, for example,
But I'd put the mulch right on top of the dirt.
right,
I mean, it would,
you're saying that it's washing onto like your
Yeah.
pathway? That's where I would find, maybe these are too big,
Okay.
but I would find little rocks to go along the edge of my path to define that maybe the path is here and I've got the mulch here. That way I've got a definer. Because you would do that exact same thing in your landscaping in your yard. You would never run the mulch right up to the rock without having something as a barrier between the two, because the exact same thing will happen. That mulch would wash right into the rock. So that you'd put that black contractor's edging in, you'd put a rock, you'd put something there to give you that barrier between the two. Same thing in your garden. You're basically, you know, you kind of think about the things that you do in your landscaping, no different. Well, here's what happens when you use plastic, landscape fabric, anything like that. What you do is you create an area that's warm, dark, and moist. And that's where mildew grows, that's where, so I don't know that I would because it traps that in there.
clear plastic.
It's also where water could stand in those areas, and then the next thing you know, you're growing the moss you don't want. Or you're creating a soil-borne disease that you don't want either. Because if you get a soil-borne disease, you might as well take everything and dump it out and start over. Because once you get a soil-borne disease, it's in the soil, you're dumping everything out and starting over.
You know that because the dirt smells or not?
No, you know that because that one is tricky because sometimes you have to test the soil for that. That's why you want to make sure that you use a nice, good, spend the money. It's not, I mean, that little bag, this bag is $2.50. I'm not telling you to go buy organic $15 bag of soil. It just needs to be sterile, have compost and peat moss in it so that it's potting soil, not dirt out of your yard or, because even if you like get like topsoil delivered to your house and you're like, oh, I'll use some of that. There is no government guidelines on topsoil. It's the top 2 inches of the soil. It could have come out of a field of weeds for all you know.
I tried that in weeds for my
Yeah,
trees.
so topsoil, when you get it that way in bulk, there is no regulation on that. It's just, it's got weed seed in it, period. It will, guaranteed. All right, any questions? Or now is question and answer time. Well, did you guys learn something? Are you going to run home and make a fairy garden? What are you going to do before you make that fairy garden? Come up with a theme and plan, because it's too easy to just buy a bunch of stuff and then you either have more than you need and then you have 10 fairy gardens, or you just have a bunch of stuff in a pot.
Go home, look through the house.
There you go.
If you have boys you're going to do it with, instead if you don't want gnomes, what other little guy? that
The
you-
little transformer figures that they have, if they have those, they work good. Little dinosaurs, Matchbox cars. I did a moonscape with one kid and we used the Star Wars people. And we did it with gray gravel and succulents, and we did these rocks, these smooth rocks, and made like rock things in it, and did a little path that we did in stone, and they had their little, I don't know what, the little glider thing that the Star Wars people, we had that in there, and we had the little guys with the white suits, the Imperial soldiers, and we had we did, it was kind of fun.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But even think about, there's some fairy tales out there that are boy. I mean, think about a vignette or a scene from Peter Pan. You know, a little crocodile and the little ship, and you could